Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Cindy McDonald. I am your instructor, and I'm so glad to have with me today one of my special friends and guests, Andrew Windham. Glad to see you.
Great to be
And we're
here.
going to talk about sports and athletes. So, welcome, Andrew. I'm glad to have you here today.
Well, thanks. Anytime you want to talk sports, that tends to be something I like. So it's fun to have conversation about topics you like with good friends, right?
That is true. And you are with the College Planning Institute. When did you found your company for the College Planning Institute?
Well, we founded or we got started actually testing a lot of the concepts and the ideas in late 2007, early 2008. We formally formed, all the legal formalities and all of that stuff in October of 2008 and kind of launched the brand and the company right at the turn of the year.
Good. And so tell us more about you and your background. How did you get into doing all of this, Andrew?
Well, I think there's a lot of things, just like everything we do in life. Every time we make a role change, or um, especially if you're an entrepreneur, we tend to do things that we like and where we feel like we can make an impact. And so I'd been in the financial services industry out of college, went to Auburn University, ran track and field there, cross country, et cetera. And that's obviously one of the reasons I love sports, because it's been a part of my life for years, still is, in a lot of capacities. But we did a lot of health insurance and those things. And if you go back and we take a stroll down memory lane back in '08, the Affordable Care Act began to come into play, and it really changed the landscape, which is interesting because I think, we're going to go through a big landscape change here in the next couple of years in higher education, kind of like healthcare. And so it just was no longer a fit. It wasn't feeding me personally in my heart and in my soul. And as you know, I tend to do things I like, and I don't tend to do anything I don't like, at least within reason. And so I was trying to figure that out. And I was actually at the baseball park with my kids, and they just also changed the rules on bats. And I saw families strolling into the park with brand new $400 bats. And that was kind of a financially difficult and contentious time, if you remember. And so the idea just popped up in my head. Given what I had done, I wanted to feel like I could make a difference and make an impact. And so I felt like the place that we could make the most impact was with our future generation, just because you have ability. They don't have all these habits and ruts and those things established in their life. And one of those areas was just college, because I just have a passion and a heart for helping folks figure out what their unique abilities. At that time, we called it area of brilliance. We get a little better with the clarity of our message, but just unique abilities and where they can make a difference. And I think so often, Cindy, we hear people say, what do you want to be when you grow up? Which I think is a horrible question, especially when you understand the mental development of kids between 14 and 24. Um, and then the next thing is, when you look at people who are generally have the most joy in their life, it's because they feel like they're being fulfilled by the service of other people through their work and their use of those abilities. So that's kind of how I came to the college scenario. And I actually came to it, as you know all too well, through the lens of sports. Because when I looked at college and what was happening in the world with finances and college and the impact it was having on families, I said, in the United States, we look at everything almost through a capitalistic supply and demand type of viewpoint. And I went to sports, and as an Auburn guy, Cam Newton, that played football at Auburn, and they won a national championship, which gets a lot of grief around Atlanta with all the Bulldog fans. But, really just long story short, Cindy, I said, what would happen if we could create a similar scenario for just the average student? Maybe not a Cam Newton or, the fastest runner in the world, or the best gymnast, or the Pele of today's time for soccer, or whatever the sport might be, Michael Phelps for swimming, right? What would UGA or Georgia Tech do if Cam Newton at that time had said, I'm only going to stay in state and go to one of those two schools? What would they be willing to put on the table? Right. And the answer is, from a sports perspective, pretty much anything, when you understand the dynamics of economics and money and all those things and the impact at colleges. And, for folks listening, they might be scratching their head and going, well, wait a second, what do you mean by that? Do you mean they'd give them money? Well, I'm not necessarily saying that, but I'm saying that stuff realistically does go on to some degree in sports, just to put it out there. Is it right? I'll leave that up to everybody's own judgment and decisions there. But I think so often, especially in the college space, we have a tendency to not look at what's going on with reality and deal with the reality, good, bad, or indifferent of the circumstances. And so that's really kind of how College Planning Institute came about, is how could we intentionally create a competitive leverage, if you will, for the student, in particular, my love for student athletes in, what we would call non-head count sports, because I think so often, Cindy, families and athletes don't understand that just because you play in college does not mean that you get a full ride, right?
Right.
And I share a statistic quite often when I speak, especially to, middle school, high school club athletes and those kind of things, is that 93% or more of all Division I student athletes pay for 50% or more of their cost of attendance. And then I intentionally put a big pregnant pause in there. And then I asked the follow-up question of, do you know what the problem is with that statistic? And then usually a parent will raise their hand and say, no, what? And then I say, the problem is the majority of families who've spent years pouring $4,000, $5,000, $10,000 a year in their kids for sports, believing that their kid could pay for school with a scholarship. You're going to find out, unfortunately, that wasn't completely accurate, or you were misinformed. And by the time you figure that out, it'll be too late. And then, of course, it's usually helpful to tie down that with a story of some kind. Baseball, the number of scholarships, Division I, how many kids are on the team, and literally just kind of help them walk through the math. Because, I don't really believe, Cindy, that people make bad decisions on purpose. And, right. and I really don't think that professionals, financial professionals, education consultants, whatever, CPAs, whatever the walk is, I just can't wrap my head around that anybody would do anything unintentional. But sometimes we make decisions where we're unholistically informed, and there are things that we don't know that we don't know. And unfortunately, I really believe that's what the epidemic is with higher education, is that people just don't understand holistically what's going on, especially from an athletics perspective. So more than you wanted to know, but there you go.
Oh, no, that's good. So how has, especially now we're just coming out of the pandemic, how has the rules for sports changed? Have they eased? Have they become more restricted? How have those changed?
Well, so I'll circle back to the rules, but I think the thing, the unspoken rules that are going on right now, and a couple of things that have happened here recently, we're beginning to see a lot of compound effect, if you will, with just changes in higher education in general, but in particular coming out of COVID, higher education is really struggling because they're not a highly adaptive industry in and of themselves. And so for years, they've kind of known they've had this problem coming with paying the bills and enrollment and those types of things. And so often higher education tends to be a lot of a Me Too industry, especially some of the smaller schools. For those listening, the trends tend to be set by, the Dukes, the Harvards, the Stanfords of the world a lot of times in admissions, and those don't necessarily work efficiently, for other institutions. But dialing it into sports in particular, you know, because there were so many unknowns, eligibility in particular has been waived for a year or so. And even it's very different from conference to conference. So, for instance, the Ivy Leagues have said, we're not going to extend additional aid or those types of things or eligibility. You're welcome to use your eligibility for graduate school or other things, but we're not going to extend access to that eligibility. Obviously, the Ivies don't give necessarily athletic scholarships like a lot of the other schools. Or maybe that's not obvious to everybody, but, doing this and that being a passion. But that doesn't mean that people can't leverage them with graduate school. But I think the really big issue that we're going to see over the next 2 to 3 years is the impact, because the reality is the colleges have to pay to some degree, not only for the education, but also the cost of the training, everything from trainers and equipment and travel and all of these things. And the smaller schools, that has a huge compound effect, especially when you get away from the big, like I like to call them the ESPN schools, right? I mean, the Alabamas, the UGAs, the Stanfords, the Arizonas, the Penn States of the world, they'll be fine, right? I mean, they generate so much revenue from the major head count sports, football, basketball, those kind of things. They'll be okay. But when you start to look at the schools like a Furman who have gotten rid of several sports, or, it's even affecting Clemson, who canceled their men's track and field program and then got so much political pressure from alumni and those things that they've reinstated it. We're just going to see a tremendous amount of consolidation and elimination. I mean, Brown has eliminated multiple sports. And so what happens is this is where it it's that. And then now, for folks that don't know, there's a transfer portal. So where at the high school level, we see parents or kids who will move, to a different high school, or they'll try to work around the rules to be able to go to a school where they feel like they can get seen or play with better athletes. That's reached a new level at the college level, because now a kid that doesn't want to stay is not locked into that scholarship, and they can put into the scholarship portal. And so the college transfer portal has never had more people in there. I forget the number, but I was listening to something the other day, and somebody said, if that many kids are unhappy, then maybe the problem is not the colleges. Maybe the problem is the student athlete, which is always a topic we're talking about when you select a school. But my point is there are so many kids that are not going to be able to be recruited in these next 2 years, because really the backlog, and it's really going to change, or it's really going to emphasize, it sports levels, every school has a different culture. So winning is more important at some schools than it is others. But for schools where there's a lot of pressure or stress to win, that's going to really make it. I think where we'll see the fallout will be the kids who in the past have been able to walk on and earn scholarships, because there's just not going to be spots available given the cost. And there's only X number of positions, obviously, that can be on scholarship, at least in the NCAA Division I, II, and III levels. And so it's really easy for the NCAA to say, oh, well, we'll waive the eligibility, but somebody's got to pay for those student athletes to be there. And we forget so often, we call them student athletes, and they're a student first before they're an athlete. And they have to be able to be a competitive eligible student to be able to compete, right? And so I just think we're going to see a lot of effects of eligibility being waived, those things. I mean, I have a son who is going to be a junior this year at an NAI school, Milligan in Johnson City, Tennessee. It's about 45 minutes for those listening who don't know where it is. It's about 45 minutes east of Knoxville. And he was blessed that he was an All-American his freshman year indoor, but literally all the COVID hit 1 week after his indoor meet. And so they granted him his full year of eligibility, which is going to work out great for him because he's athletically blessed. That's going to give him the opportunity to be able to stay and have a paid 5th year and get an MBA now. So for some kids, it's going to work well. For others, it's going to be really tough. He's got a great friend that was playing at Liberty, and they pulled his scholarship because they had the opportunity to recruit more talent. And so all of these things, you know, that's what makes it overwhelming, complex. It's really why I think there's a value in having somebody who does this all the time. Because, you know, as I say sometimes in workshops, there are a lot of things that people feel like they can do on their own, but there are some things like picking the right school, figuring out the most efficient way to pay for it, planning for retirement. You really only get one shot to do it the right way. And if you don't do it the right way, it can have really devastating long-term effects. And I don't mean that from a fear or scare tactic. I just really believe, as you know, in hiring great people and great experts to be around you so that you can do what you're good at.
So Andrew, so you're saying that because there are so many athletes that maybe weren't playing and now they're playing, or they weren't, you know, they're on a gap year or something like that, that they're going to be now coming up, and it's going to create more competition for athletes in the future. Is that, am I understanding that right?
I think it's going to take, that's a true statement, but let's use the word compression. It's going to compress the amount of talent that is vying for X number of spots. There's not unlimited demand. I mean, a Division I football team, whether they're an ESPN school or, you know, they're not an ESPN school. We'll go back to a Furman or you know, a deal like that. They've got 85 scholarship positions that they can use. I mean, that's what they have. And so, you know, kids that were walking on and hoping to get that spot because of the way coaches have doled out scholarships, you know, they have a maximum they can give out in a year, but some years they don't use them all. And that's where we hear things like red shirt and gray shirt and all these things where, and obviously that's a trend where kids, you know, for schools, at least around Atlanta, if they're on a block schedule, they actually can graduate by, you know, December of their senior year, after fall semester, their senior year. And so no longer are they waiting or going right out of high school in the summer to train. They're going in almost getting a half year training under their belt and getting acclimated academically with school, which, by the way, for the right student and the right culture is a great thing because it gives them a little more time to get academically and environmentally acclimated, right? Before they get the pressure and the demands that go with athletics. And, you know, I'll just throw this other thing. I know you didn't ask for it, but they call it the Nick Saban rule. And so a couple of years ago, the NCAA said that they're not actually in the head count sports. They're not actually going to apply the head count limitation until a student athlete is has finished their sophomore academic qualification. And so what that means is a student athlete could be recruited, for instance, for football, and they could give them a 25% or a 15% scholarship. It no longer in the first 2 years has to be a full ride, all or nothing type of a deal. And they can supplement that with academic monies, alumni dollars, whatever scholarship they want to call it. But the clock strikes midnight at the end of the academic year of the sophomore year. And then that coach has to make a decision in a head count sport. Will you put them on a full ride or will you not? They can't do partial scholarships in some of those head count sports. And that's another thing that's pushing a lot of kids into the transfer portal. And so when you think about it, you're getting this compression that we're talking about because you've got student athletes that are already there. Now we add COVID, so they get an extra year of eligibility, so they can hang around it another year, even though they may have competed. Then you've got kids that are finishing in JUCO or 2-year schools, and so now they're wanting to enter into, you know, a 4-year college type of environment. And you've got those kids that maybe struggled academically, might be the reason they went JUCO. So now they've kind of got that buttoned up, and they've eliminated that weakness. So now you've got really great athletes that maybe have buttoned up that weakness trying to get into a 4-year school. Then obviously you have the folks coming up from the high schools, right? And
Right.
so, and then you got folks trying to transfer. So whereas you might have had 1 or 2 dynamics you were having to manage, now you really kind of have a compound effect that one stress in and of itself, not a big deal, but you're getting maybe 4 or 5 or more. And it just has a compound synergy effect for that competition you're talking about.
Wow. So, and you mentioned another thing that I was not familiar with at all, and that's the transfer portal. Tell us more about that. Is this new or has this always been around?
So the transfer portal was developed, I'll fall on the sword here. I can't remember the exact time frame, but it's been around for about 2 or 3 years,
Okay.
maybe a little bit longer. But you know, I can't really think of a good analogy, if you will, that would help you understand or that would illustrate this change. But the portal was there as a way, kind of a continuation of the NCAA eligibility stuff from high school to college or from JUCO to whatever. And it's really a part of managing eligibility, but you used to need to have a bona fide reason that you were going to transfer without having to, for instance, sit out a year. And so now they've adjusted some of those sit out rules. So for instance, a college gets an opportunity to decide whether they want to make the kid sit out or not. And if you think about it, just like if we were talking NFL sports, you know, the Minnesota Vikings weren't really excited when, the Green Bay Packers weren't really excited when Brett Favre hopped over to Minnesota, their fierce rival, to play quarterback. Well, so if you could imagine, you know, UGA is not exactly dying to let a quarterback go from there to Auburn or Alabama or somebody, Clemson, that they might compete with. And so they kind of get a say on some of those things. And now there's obviously appeals processes, but it used to be automatically, if you wanted to transfer out, you set out. And now that's not necessarily the case. And a lot of that has evolved because, you know, a lot of things in college sports are obviously dictated by money and
Right.
football, which is the largest revenue generator for most schools. And so, you know, you would see the Nick Sabans of the world who would leave, or, you know, somebody would leave. I'm drawing a blank on the coach that's at Penn State right now that was at Vanderbilt for a couple of years, but you know, he got this huge raise, and then Vanderbilt's coach left. Penn State's coach left, and so he went there. And so all of these kids he'd spent a year or two or whatever, recruiting, they're there. And you know, that's something we should talk about. It's one of the things that I think in recruiting, you should not go to a school specifically because of the coach, because the coach could be gone tomorrow and that can completely change the culture. But when that happened, you know, you get these parents and folks that are upset, and they have I think a plausible argument. You know, the coach leaves and he goes somewhere else. Well, wait a second. Now, new coach comes in, changes the offense or the philosophy or whatever. And so now a kid who thought he was going to go to a school that was going to be a run and shoot, they want to go to a power eye type of formation. And now this kid becomes obsolete in the new thing. And so why should the kid be trapped? Why shouldn't the kid? And so that led to the portal where, you know, honestly, sadly, we are seeing scenarios just like we're seeing in some high schools where kids are going to 3-4 different colleges. There's a kid from a local high school in Atlanta that was highly recruited, went to West Virginia, didn't make it there, went to another college, and now he's on his 3rd college, seeking to try to get, you know, somewhere to play.
Mhm.
And I, that's where we also have to be realistic about what our future is, right? I mean, so few people are ever going to go pro. And, in my sport, track and field and cross country, I say, well, hey, even if you go pro, you're still going to have a job. So maybe that shouldn't be your ambition, or at least your primary ambition, right?
That's true. Very true. So you've mentioned head count, non-head count sports. Can you explain that a little bit more? Not everybody's going to know what that means.
Yeah, sure. So I would refer you, because there is some ebb and flow to that, but generally your head count sports are football, basketball, men's and women's. Women's volleyball is a head count sport.
Hmm.
And I'm gonna show my weakness here just a little bit, but I have heard that women's equestrian is a head count sport, or is headed that way. So what a head count sport means is that you have to get a full ride or not to be able to play. But by the way, that's not the same at every school, at every level, those types of things. Non-head count sports are where there can be partial scholarships. And one of the areas that I see this play out a lot is in baseball. Because baseball has, 13 scholarships, and 13 and a fraction scholarships. And so if you look at the average baseball team, there's typically 25 to 30, student athletes on the team. And as a general rule, if you kind of look at the trends across the country, there's usually no more than 3 student athletes that are on a full ride. But let's just say there's not 3, there's 2. So that means if we do the math, if there's just 25 student athletes on the team and there's 13 scholarships to go around for the whole team, then that means if 2 of them are on full ride, we have 11 scholarships to fill out the other 23 spots. So even if we said there were only 24 on the team, at best, that means that each of the other 22 student athletes would at best only have 50%. And so that illustrates the point that 93% of Division I student athletes have to pay for 50% or more. And there's also nuances that the NCAA has changed from those scholarships. So it used to be, for instance, that I'll use my alma mater, Auburn, as an example, that Auburn could give in-state, they could waive out-of-state tuition cost, and then they could give a 50% in-state scholarship. Well, Auburn out of state's about $53,000. In state, it's closer to about 32. So that's about a $21,000 swing. So if they could waive out of state tuition and then give 50% of 32 or $16,000, that's very different from now. They can't do that. They can only give 50% of the total cost of attendance with no deference or differentiation between in-state and out-of-state cost. So think about the difference there. That's a $10,000 plus swing for a student athlete who would be out of state going to like an institution like Auburn. And so if you think about it, that gives a huge upside to like a UGA or a Georgia Tech. And when you start to look at non-head count sports, I will show preference to track and field, because I coach a middle school cross country and track and field team, kids 5th through 8th grade. And so I love pouring into them, but I also love seeing them develop through high school. And so a lot of athletes in Georgia, they're going to run at UGA or Georgia Tech for 2 reasons. They're using the athletics as a hook to be more valuable in the admissions process, but 2, it's just flat more affordable using things like the Hope or Zell than it would be to go out of state. And a great example would be, let's say you want to do engineering, and because you've got a highly competitive time or performance in one of the events, so that gives you a special leg up or hook, as we would call it, in the the very competitive admissions process for engineering at Tech. And so now you're in, and then if you have the Zell, which you would practically have if you're a competitive applicant at Georgia Tech, 3.7 GPA and a 26 or better on the ACT, 1200 on the SAT, just to kind of as a marker. Well, now the track program can give you, 15% or books in 15%, or a lot of these athletic programs, they're going to iPads or things like that. So they can give an iPad and all the books will be there and they have unlimited printing costs or things like that. And so universities are getting creative in how they can manage some of these things, correct? So in doing that, that makes Georgia or Georgia Tech compared to an Auburn or another school financially, which is, by the way, according to the latest college study, the number one factor for why people are choosing college. In the most recent how families pay for college with Sally Mae, which is scary, but it's the reality of what we're living in, right?
And repeat that again. What are they choosing as the number one thing?
That the cost is the number one most influential factor. And it's always been a factor, but in the last 2 years, it has become the predominant factor, more than fit, more than career availability. Some families are literally choosing a school just based off the price tag. And that's dangerous, I think, in a lot of ways.
That's very true. So when you go back to recruiting, just a couple more questions here. Which sports recruit at the youngest, and what age is that?
That's interesting because I remember the first student athlete I had as a client that was a lacrosse player, and she was being recruited in 8th grade.
Wow.
And by toward the end of fall of 9th grade, she received an offer and the coach gave her 30 days to make a decision. Now you might be scratching your head saying, well, wait a second. I thought there were recruiting timelines and hands off. But what I learned is that in lacrosse, there was kind of a gentleman's agreement that nobody was going to turn anybody in or get investigated for violating the recruiting rules. And so, your powerhouses for lacrosse, think Northeast, think Denver, think, Notre Dame, those types of schools, they would pretty much have their recruiting class, Cindy, filled out by the end of sophomore year at the latest. So they were recruiting and watching kids in these highly competitive club programs all the way back 6th, 7th grade. And of course, probably a few people have heard where Lane Kiffin, when he was at Tennessee, gave a 6-year-old kid a scholarship. He promised him a scholarship, and there's all of those things. But the day and age are gone, which is why I scratch my head when families are moving to a high school to get seen. With technology in this day and age, you're not going to, if you have the capability, we're not going to get one of those blindside types of situations where, a kid just pops out of nowhere, senior year. Could it happen? Yes. Is it probable? It's highly, highly improbable that happens unless you have a situation where you have a kid that grows 6-7 inches, puts on a lot of weight over the summer, and just really grows into, a more aggressive, competitive, body format for a sport or that type of thing. Or I guess you could have a scenario where you have a kid who's never been in sports and just decides to try it out and, is an overnight phenom. But by and large, with the time and the energy and the technology and the focus on health, that just doesn't lend itself to a high probability anymore, in my opinion.
So it sounds like more the recruiting and the eyes of the coaches is more on the, as you said, the elite clubs or the competitive clubs, as opposed to go to your high school and be seen at the local football game or something like that.
Well, I mean, when every sport has their nuances, but if you look at football right now, the time and the attention, especially for key positions, are in the 7-on-7s. That's why we've seen an explosion of 7-on-7s now. So quarterbacks, especially the skills positions, they get picked up big time there. We're starting to see these, Nike and Adidas and Under Armour have these elite camps where the top kids go, and they go to these showcases, and they put those together. That's where Justin Fields, that was just drafted, went to a local high school, Harrison High School, played at UGA, then transferred to Ohio State, and then just recently got drafted by the Bears. That, he's actually a great example of kids that were on the map early and changed high schools, and then changed. He didn't change high schools. He reclassed. That's another story for another day, but he reclassed and then went to UGA, transferred to Ohio State, and then now's been drafted. Incredible athlete. But he got picked up and hit the radar on 7-on-7s. And then when he went out to a Nike thing, his draft stock went literally through the roof, because his team won and he was the quarterback out there at that camp. So it's 7-on-7s there. For basketball, it's definitely the AAU, or the equivalent circuit. There's the Nike elite showcases and those types of things. Track and field, it can be USATF stuff, but there are now, New Balance showcase meets, and we're starting to see COVID, believe it or not, where some folks were being held apart. There were a bunch of athletes that were coordinating the ability, since they didn't have a track season, to figure out how they could get together in regions, and basically with no crowds, have somebody video them running a highly competitive mile or those types of things. We're starting to see more of that pop up. When you look at it, definitely baseball, summer baseball is highly competitive. Just right up the road from my office, Lake Point, one of the biggest, most competitive, baseball organizations there, that they play throughout the summer. Perfect game and some of those. Then you look at, volleyball has their circuit. So all of the schools have that. I think in the past, high school was enough. I got to tell you that I believe that the trend has, depending upon opinion, for better or maybe for worse, it has evolved. Can a student athlete be seen at the high school level? Yes. Do they get an advantage? Like, I think that they are pitched from playing highly competitive club soccer, those types of things. Is there an advantage there? Maybe. I don't think it's generally because the folks who are pitching, getting folks in school for college or scholarships, they're doing anything that's that exceptional. It's just proximity of being in highly competitive around great folks. Because if you're a basketball coach, you really can't go recruit basketball kids in season while you're playing college basketball. If you think about, right, they're playing 2-3 times on, traveling on the road, those kind of things. So when are they going to see the kids? And if they're going to see them, where are they going to go? Well, Lake Point or Nike or Adidas has a big showcase. Well, if you're a Division I athlete and there's going to be, 45 of the top 200 athletes that are going to be at this tournament, well, what's the most efficient way to see them is to show up, and you get a comparative, because they're playing, equivalent talent. There's no value in seeing a kid who is 5 inches taller and 150, if you saw LeBron James, for instance, playing basketball in high school, the average kid he's playing against, he's just an anomaly, right? And so you don't have as much a frame of reference. So I think we're seeing that more and more as be the trend. Everybody kind of has their own deal. Tennis and a lot of the Olympic sports, they tend to have their own unique thing that may be year round or those other things. And absolutely, maybe to the detriment of the kids and their childhood, we're seeing parents go all in and spend thousands and thousands of dollars in hopes to kind of get their kid over the bar, so to speak, to be able to pay for college. And I would be remiss to that point, Cindy, if I didn't say that sometimes if parents spend as much time pouring in and parenting their kid on the things that matter, and then also focusing on the academics and a little less investment in money on those types of things, they might could pay for college and wouldn't need to depend on the scholarship. In some cases, it's really sad for me to see families that are hardworking, good blue collar families that scrimp and scrounge and work a third job to be able to pay $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 a year to play basketball, but they really just don't have the capability, the talent. It's not the want to or the work drive. They just don't have the talent to play at Kentucky. Think about it. There's only 12 guys on a Kentucky basketball team at any given time in most cases. So you think about it, like, it's great that you aspire to do that, but you've got to be one of the top, 2 or 3 players in the entire, top 50 in the country to go play at a Kentucky in a given year. or excuse me, not to play, to get on the team. Then you got to try to earn a spot to play. So.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it's gotten so much, the focus has shifted from the schools to as you said, the efficient type of things, or the places where the coaches can actually see the students, or the, special programs or competitions, or, different venues. But then that makes me wonder about equity and access. I mean, if a family or parent doesn't have the money to do all that, then where does that leave them?
Well, it's interesting because it kind of in some ways depends upon the sports. The reality is that in certain sports like football, basketball, the financial payoff for the folks at the pro level. I mean, Atlanta has a league that is forming where they've put together corporate sponsorships for basketball. And a local kid here that is graduating from Kell High School, Auburn was recruiting. He's going straight to the G League, and they're going to pay him $1 million a year just to go straight from high school to the local G League to play. The people who the young men and young women who get left in the dust are the ones who are not the elite. The elite always get found, and somebody's willing to, figure out a way, in many cases for ulterior personal selfish motives, to, figure out how they help them get ahead in hopes that they'll get a huge payoff, down the road when the kid makes it big. But the ones that really get hurt are the ones that there's not a realism for what the capability is. And
Mm-hmm.
that's difficult. As you know, I own Georgia Prep Sports Network. And so we broadcast high school football, basketball, and baseball all over the state. And it's disheartening because you'll talk to a parent and they'll say, well, did you see my kid? And you don't want to hurt their feelings. Like, sure, looks like a great kid. And they're like, yeah, he's going to play basketball at Kentucky, or, he's going to build be a starting running back at Alabama. And when you've played college athletics, or you've been around that at a really high level, like I had the blessing to do, you just kind of have an eye or an ability to tell, wow, that kid is you can see that they are a Division I athlete. A great example was Nick Chubb several years ago was playing a local high school as a freshman. He played tailback, middle linebacker, place kick, punted, kicked off, returned both punts and kicks. I literally don't remember him leaving the field as a freshman. And he played against one of the best defenses at the time in the state, and he had 300 all-purpose yards as a freshman. Wow. And this was on a team that had a less than 500 winning record. When you see things like that and you have a point of comparison, you immediately know that kid is going to play, major football, likely has a good shot to play on Sundays. And so when you see that and you compare it to other folks, I think level setting is really important. And I also would be remiss if I didn't say this, Cindy. You know, there are a lot of kids that could get college paid for if they would focus on the academics and then they would shoot for the appropriate level to play. And so when we're working or talking with families about, you know, a potential student athlete versus just being a college student, the first thing I'm trying to figure out is who's motivated. Is it mom and dad that are motivated?
Right. Right.
Or is it the student athlete? Because here's the reality: at virtually any level, athletics in college is the equivalent of, at minimum, a part-time job. For many people, it's a full-time job. I mean, when I was in college at Auburn, we ran 80 to 100 miles a week. I mean, I want you to think about the time that it takes to run, but then there's the self-care, there's the training room, there's all the other things that you still have to go to class and study and all those things to be eligible. And it can mold you through the stress, healthy stress, into an incredibly productive individual. And it can give you some career advantages when you get out, but you got to play at the right place. And it's, in some ways, it's like for kids who are a valedictorian at their high school, and then they get into Harvard. Well, it's great they got into Harvard, but how many other valedictorians are there? And so how do they grapple mentally with, they went from being number one to just being average? And you're in a group or a cohort that is an exceptional average, right? But I mean, it is a cold, hard awakening when you take a kid who is used to, you know, being the fastest kid on his team and the best athlete by far. And then he shows up at the college and he looks around, he's like, holy cow, where did all these athletes come? Like, where'd all these people come from? Right. And it can be really, really difficult mentally, because especially at Division I schools where they're highly competitive, the coach gets paid to win. And so sadly, they may not value the athlete, which is part of your investigatory process and the recruiting process, is to try to disseminate. Does the culture they have, is it win at all cost, or does he care about the athletes? Is he committed to their long-term future? I mean, John Wooden is historically one of the most notable coaches who, you know, he won, but he won because of the culture that he built. And if you talk to the Waltons of the world, he poured into the human being of the student athlete. And to me, that's what we as parents and as education consultants have to try to help our student athletes focus on, because that's where, as mentors and as coaches and guides, we can make the most long-term generational impact on those student athletes.
Yeah. And that's what we're really looking for as we work with our students. Andrew, thank you so much. There's so much to cover, and we could probably spend another hour or so, but thank you. This has been very helpful, and I love your passion and depth of knowledge in this. So thanks for sharing.
I appreciate you having me.
All right.
We probably didn't get through what you wanted to get through. I don't know.